Did you know that some texts in the Bible have not just one, but two meanings? Let's check it out on this episode of Masterpiece. Hey everyone, welcome to another Masterpiece episode. My name is Chris, and I want to help you take your Bible study experience to the next level and discover just how beautiful and fascinating this book really is. If you're new here, thanks so much for stopping by, and of course, make sure you hit that subscribe button and activate the bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming exciting episodes. And if you find the video helpful, remember to give it a thumbs up and share it with anyone you think might also benefit from it. So as I've said before, one of the reasons the Bible is such a fascinating and deep book is because the biblical authors wrote their texts with great intentionality, which simply means everything that's in this book is there for a reason and has meaning. And sometimes there's even more than one meaning. This is something that's actually quite common in the area of literature, and the Bible is no exception to that. So, if you want to take your Bible study experience to a deeper level, this is definitely something you'll want to keep in mind as you study biblical texts. All right, so how does this actually work? Well, let's go to the text and look at a couple of examples, one in the Old Testament and one in the New Testament. And we'll start in the New Testament in the Gospel of John and there in chapter 13. So, John chapter 13. So as you may remember, in this chapter, Jesus and his disciples are eating the Passover meal together just before his crucifixion. And during that meal, Jesus tells them that one of them will betray him. And of course, the disciples want to know who it is. And Jesus says, "The one to whom I will give this piece of bread when I have dipped it." And he dips it and gives it to Judas. And then it says in verse 30, "So after receiving the morsel, he," that is Judas, "went out immediately, and it was night." Okay, so John here explicitly informs us that it was night, which first of all simply lets us know what time of day it was when Judas went out to betray Jesus. In other words, Judas didn't betray Jesus openly, but secretly. Not in broad daylight, but at night. But once you think about it some more, you realize that there seems to be another meaning intended. Especially since from the very beginning of his gospel, John has been talking about light and darkness in a symbolic way. So when he says that it was night when Judas went out, he also seems to be saying something about Judas's spiritual condition. According to verse 27, Satan, the prince of darkness, had entered Judas. So when Judas left the one who called himself the light of the world, all that remained was darkness. So notice, even though John never explicitly evaluates what Judas does, he does communicate his point of view to us. We just have to read the text carefully enough to see it. Okay, so that was an example from the New Testament. Now let's go to the Old Testament. And since we've been in Genesis so much recently, let's go back there once more, and specifically we'll go to Genesis 27. So, Genesis chapter 27. Which is the well-known story of Jacob pretending to be Esau in order to get the blessing. And as you may remember, we already talked about verse 18 of this chapter just a couple of videos ago. So we've looked at verse 18. This time, let's go to the very beginning of the chapter. So, Genesis chapter 27, verse 1, which says, "Now it came about when Isaac was old, and his eyes were too dim to see, that he called his older son Esau and said to him, 'My son.' And he said to him, 'Here I am.'" Okay, so notice that right at the beginning of this story, the author explicitly tells us two things about Isaac. Number one, that he was old, and number two, that his eyes were too dim to see. Now remember, he didn't have to tell us this. He could have just said, "Now it came about that Isaac called his older son Esau and said to him," and so forth. Which means, if he does explicitly mention these things, they must be important in some way. Which raises the question, how so? Well, if you think about it, the fact that Isaac was old is important because it explains why he wanted to bless his son. In fact, that's what he himself says in verse 2. He's old, meaning he's getting closer to the end of his life. He doesn't know when he will die, and therefore he wants to take care of this important matter before that happens. Makes sense. And the fact that he can't see is obviously important because it explains why Rebekah and Jacob's plan actually worked. It was because of Isaac's blindness that Jacob was able to pretend to be Esau and get away with it. But there seems to be another reason why the author mentions that Isaac was old and that he couldn't see anymore, and that reason becomes evident once you take the context into account. Notice that at the end of the previous chapter, of chapter 26, so just prior to the verse we're looking at, there is a brief report in verses 34 to 35 about Esau taking 2 heathen wives when he was 40 years old, and that these wives brought grief, or as it literally says, who were a bitterness of spirit, to Isaac and Rebekah. Okay, so Esau takes 2 wives, which, by the way, associates him with a man named Lamech, who is mentioned at the end of Cain's genealogy in Genesis 4, and there seems to stand representative for the line of the godless, and who is the only person prior to Genesis 26 who has 2 wives at the same time. So Esau takes 2 wives, which associates him with a wicked, godless man, and both of those wives are heathens who make the life of his parents bitter. But just 2 verses later, Isaac wants to bless precisely that son. And once you see that progression, the information in verse 1 that Isaac couldn't see all of a sudden takes on a deeper meaning. Because in this context, it apparently doesn't just refer to his literal eyesight, but also to his spiritual one. Esau acts like an unbeliever and brings much grief to his parents. But because Isaac's eyes are dim so that he cannot see, he nevertheless wants to bless him. So just like in John 13, the author never explicitly tells us how Isaac's course of action should be evaluated. And yet, when we take a closer look, we see that he does tell us. In fact, he tells us in more than just one way. Remember that he also informed us that Isaac was old? Well, it's probably not a coincidence that the last time the word old occurred was at the beginning of chapter 24, where we are told that Abraham was old. And what does Abraham do in that chapter? He sends out his servant to get a wife for his son, and he has him swear that he will not take a heathen woman, but someone from his family. And when the servant gets there, he doesn't just pick someone, but prays to God for wisdom and guidance. And how old is Isaac at that time? He's 40, just like Esau. Which means, through the allusion to Genesis 24 and the resulting contrast between Abraham and Isaac, as well as between Isaac and Esau, the author once again provides an evaluation of Esau and Isaac's actions. And at the same time, reveals a better course of action, not just for Isaac and Esau, but also for you and me. All right, so I hope you can see that noticing double meanings in the Bible can be really, really helpful. Not just to get a better understanding of texts, but also to discover what the author's point of view is and how he evaluates what is going on in a text. Because once you know that, it becomes a lot clearer how the text can be applied to your own life. So next time you study your Bible, be aware that there just might be more than one meaning in what you're reading. And if you discover a text like that, let me know in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one. Ciao.